Thank you. Okay, so yeah, I'm Adam. I will probably stay mostly over here, so I try not to block too much of the screen. And yeah, I'm going to talk to you about crate security. I'm based in Canada. I work at the Rust Foundation as a software developer, focused mostly on ecosystem security, which in practice means trying to find malware in crates and helping to deal with things like what happened that some of you may have seen last night, where somebody tried to impersonate crates.io to get people's GitHub tokens. So that was fun. Definitely a bit of a later bedtime than I expected. I'm also a member of the Rust crates.io team. I should note, I'm not speaking, in spite of the t-shirt I'm wearing, I'm not speaking in an official capacity for the Rust Foundation, but if I say something smart, it's definitely the official position of the Rust Foundation. So we're going to work our way through this pretty quickly because it's a fairly short talk. I'm going to cover two general areas. So we're going to talk about supply chain security in general and the work that I know of that's taking place to improve supply chain security. And secondly, we're going to talk about taking that and some practical tools that you can hopefully use to improve your own supply chain security and improve the security of the dependencies that you rely upon. Or put another way, I'm going to spend the first half of the talk scaring you and then the second half telling you that it's all really going to be okay. The general concept of supply chain security is not a very hard one. Everything that you use, particularly in a language like Rust, uses something else that relies on something else, and all of that needs to be secure for the things that you build to be secure. Practically, it's almost impossible to avoid that sort of chain in practice. Even if you're working on, an embedded system like James has just been talking about, you still have to depend on, even if you don't have the standard library, you have to depend on the compiler, you have to depend on potentially an operating system, and all of those things need to be secure as well. So let's dig into it. Here's an example of a simple crate, Serde, which most of you probably know. And even Serde has 6 dependencies, and I'm pretty sure that David Tolnay has made significant efforts to try and minimize the number of dependencies that he actually has. So what that means is when we use Serde, we're not pulling in one crate, we're pulling in, whatever that adds up to, 6 or 7, I think it is. And this can add up really fast because some things are more complicated than others. This is a text editor called Zed. Some of you may have heard of it, and it's written completely in Rust. And Zed immediately has, it's on the screen behind me, 164 direct dependencies. But then when you look at the whole tree, there's 1,115 dependencies that are being pulled in. So that's 1,115 crates that have to be secure. I won't bother trying to show the cargo tree output here. I tried to graph it and it really didn't work very well. But the point is that that's a lot of dependencies, right? And even smaller things. There's a project called BAT, which is basically a written in Rust better version of cat, and that has 30 direct and 119 transitive crate dependencies. Many of these are things I recognize from my own work. They're sort of, a lot of these are the standard sorts of things that you would tend to pull in, like clap, if you're doing any sort of command line parsing. And I'd say, my job, I write a lot of small tools to do one-time analyses, and I would say the average one of those projects probably pulls in 80 to 100 dependencies, and that's before anything async, anything involving Tokyo, and so on. So the point is, there's lots of stuff. So I'm going to posit 3 things at this point. Firstly, you're pulling in a lot of code that you don't control. Now I'm generalizing. In the case of Serde, David Tolnay probably does actually control all of those dependencies, but if you're pulling in clap and you're pulling in other things, then that's not so much the case. But it gets worse. You haven't read that code. I certainly haven't. Let's take clap again as an example. It has about 96,000 lines of Rust code. Now, I've met Ed Page a couple of times, I'm sure he's writing good code, but let's not pretend that I've actually reviewed it in any great detail. I've probably literally opened the code base once or twice ever to figure out a couple of corner cases. But, like most of you here, I don't just get to write Rust for fun. I mean, writing Rust is fun, but I don't get to do it for fun. I have to do it because I work on it and I have deadlines, which means I don't have time to dive into, 119 dependencies and review all of those code bases. It just doesn't work that way. So why does this matter? So I'm not going to go deeply into the history of supply chain security attacks or anything like that. We have seen examples in recent years of attacks by, a mixture of kids in basements and probably nation states and everything in between looking to hack into sensitive systems. The famous one from last year is this thing called XZ. I'm not going to rehash the history on this. You can search for it if you like. I suspect most of you have heard of it at this point. Another example, and a good example of something called typo squatting, is this Python package. So there's a commonly used Python package called Fabric, which somebody basically wrote a tool called, or a package called Fabrice. So they added an E to the end. And that's a common name in some European countries, which means they were hoping that somebody would just typo it. They've typed Fabrice so many times that they would install the wrong thing. And then their AWS keys got sent to whoever wrote this, and presumably bad things happened thereafter. So there's a lot of this stuff out there. I picked on this one because I'm going to show you some Rust examples of other malware later. But this takes many forms. Now, the slightly good news here is this is one of those things that large tech companies really care about because they need their code to be secure. So there are projects, including my own role, which are basically being funded to try and find these things and defend against them. So there's quite a bit of work taking place right now to try and mitigate some of these. Something that shipped a couple of months ago is this thing called Trusted Publishing on crates.io. And thank you to Alpha Omega who funded this work. And what this allows you to do is you can set up your entire crate release process to operate completely out of CI. At the moment, it only supports GitHub Actions, but the intention is to support other platforms in due course. We would also very happily, with my crates.io team member hat on, we would very happily accept help on this. And the point of this is it basically means you do your releases out of your CI with ephemeral credentials, which means that it gets rid of one particular risk where somebody gets a password or an API key and can use that forever. If the API key is only good for 15 minutes and it only ever exists in the CI system, then the window of opportunity for somebody to take advantage of that is very small. There's also an ongoing project for signing crates and Rust releases with a chain of trust using this thing called Tough. The co-author of this is Josh Triplett, who is in fact here. You can go find him and talk to him about this. And this is going to unlock a lot of things. In the short term, one of the key things it unlocks is the ability to securely mirror crates and Rust releases into environments where you may not have unrestricted access to the internet. And in the longer term, this will also provide the building blocks for crate authors to publish crates with attestation saying that this was really the thing they meant to publish and that it is to be trusted. And there are many entities operating in this space. I just threw a few on this slide. I mentioned Alpha Omega. They provide a significant amount of funding to various ecosystems, including us, for doing this sort of security work. The Rust Foundation itself also covers some of this. OpenSSF is a Linux Foundation subsidiary that also funds and acts as a shared space for a lot of this work. And Ecosystems is up there as well because they're doing a lot of analysis around this sort of thing. So that's the theoretical component. Let's talk a little bit more about practically what we can do. And I've already touched on one of these things. Practically, if you are publishing crates, you can use trusted publishing to improve the security of your publication process. So as we discussed earlier, the naive approach of, I'm just going to read every line of code I depend upon probably won't work in practice. Maybe it will if you're a very fast reader and you have more time than I do, but it probably won't work. So if you can't do that, what data do we have out there and what tools do we have out there to make informed decisions about what things we add to our cargo.toml files. Now, one option is obviously you could just not depend on things. And that's a valid option too. I think sometimes, and I'm very guilty of this, sometimes it's very easy to go, oh, I'm just going to cargo add this one thing because it's quicker and it's easier. And so there are times where you should take a step back and think about whether that's actually the thing that you should do. But equally, when I think back to why I use Rust and why I started with Rust, the standard library and the crate ecosystem were significant parts of why. Because I didn't ever want to have to build a hash map again or something like that. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind, but practically we're probably still going to add dependencies most of the time. So if we've decided we're going to add dependencies, what can we look at? Now, unfortunately, there isn't really a thing I can point at that says, hey, this thing is definitely secure. But there are some hints, but some of them can be misleading. So I've sorted, this is a crates.io search for async, and I've sorted it by all-time downloads, and because the crates.io search engine isn't very good, the top 2 items actually aren't that useful. But if we look at the popularity, that's fine. Tokyo appears, that's probably what you want if you're doing async stuff to a first approximation. But download counts can be gamed. It's very easy for someone to set up a farm of the servers that they extracted from the AWS keys that they got from that typo squatting attack earlier to bump up download numbers. So it can be extremely misleading. It's not useless, but it's probably not a strong signal. There are other things that we can look at. So there's there are actually a few efforts to try and categorize crates that are available in the Rust ecosystem and look at what is, say, recommended, widely used, high quality. This is one called blessed.rs. It's literally at that address. I quite like it. There are others. There is Awesome Rust. There are, I think, more specific ones for things like async, embedded, and so on. And these can be really useful tools. But again, they're only as trustworthy as their sources. Once you have decided to add a crate to your dependencies, then of course you need to know what they depend on and what they depend on. One way of doing this is to generate an SBOM, a software bill of materials. There are multiple tools. I am not going to go into any of the theory on that. But you can also, cargo itself can actually tell you what's coming in. And sometimes that's actually all you really need to at least start the process of figuring out what you have. So, for example, we can take the output of cargo tree and we're going to get, I'm going to try and hop out of the way, we're going to get the most commonly used dependencies that appear more than once in the dependency graph for this project that I was working on. And the punchline basically is there's proc macro 2 is 30, there's Serde, there's quote, there's sin, there's Tokyo. So again, that kind of gives you a sense of, okay, maybe these are the things I should be looking at if I'm trying to figure out the security of what I have. So once you've identified some crates that you want to go look at, you really need to figure out what's important to you and how you analyze them. Now, I'm going to talk about things I like to look at when I look at a dependency. This is not universally correct. Many of you will probably disagree with some of the things I have up here, and that's okay. I think the point is more to be systematic and consistent about it. So we're going to dig into each of these a bit more, but basically the things I try to think about when I'm looking at whether I trust a dependency are code quality, security history, development practices, and sustainability. So we'll start with the first one, which is code quality. Fundamentally, there's not really a substitute for reading the code and reviewing it. But like I said, that requires you to have enough time to be able to read the code and review it. So what other options do we have here? There's a concept of distributed code review platforms that I find pretty interesting. And the idea behind that is that other people have the same problem, right? You know, if somebody wants to use a dependency, they might go review it, and then once they've reviewed it, you could publish that review in a form that others can use, and then you can, you know, decide how much you trust that review or not, but the point is it gives you additional data. So we can stand on the shoulders of others to some extent. There are two tools that I know of, two distributed code platforms, review platforms that I know of in the Rust ecosystem, Cargo Vet and Cargo Crev. There are probably more that I'm just ignorant of. And I'm mostly going to focus on Cargo Vet just because in practice it seems to be the one that's had a little bit more uptake. So again, the idea behind this is that you take your code review and you publish it. And so this is the Cargo Vet format, and it's just a very simple TOML-based format where somebody, this is from the Google source, so each review entity, so each company basically that publishes these, publish their own reviews. So this is an audit of the AHASH crate. This is from Google's. So they did a review of version 0.8.3. And you can specify criteria, and there are a couple built into Cargo Vet. There's one called Safe to Run, which basically is what it says. And there's one called, this is one, a Google-specific one called Does Not Implement Crypto. And so you could look at this and you can say, okay, somebody reviewed AHASH 0.8.3 and found it to be safe. Now, how much you trust that depends on how much you trust Google to do this correctly. But the point is, because you can judge it on a case-by-case basis or a source-by-source basis, you have some ability to actually make that decision. Cargo Vet comes with a command line tool that I do not have enough time to show you, but it's pretty nifty. I suggest you go look at it. This data also gets published on lib.rs, which is an alternative front end into the crates.io database. And so this is for Surday, and you can see 1.0.219, which was the current version when I did these slides a couple of weeks ago. Also got a review that said it was safe to deploy, does not implement crypto, and UB risk 2 is Google's way of saying there is low risk of unsafe breakage, basically. So that's useful. We can look at this and decide if that is something that helps us say, okay, maybe that's a crate that we don't need to do a line-by-line review of. But of course, if you do decide to do a line-by-line review, you have to decide what you want to do. These are sorts of the immediate things I personally look at, which is any use of unsafe, build.rs scripts, and proc macros. Because to me, they're the places it's most likely that somebody is going to hide something malicious. Unsafe in particular is interesting and subtle, and that's one of those things where I would definitely also lean on other people's reviews if possible. There is a catch though, which is if you're going to review Rust code, the aforementioned build scripts and proc macros will be run on your computer or wherever you're reviewing it as soon as you open it in an editor or an IDE that uses Rust Analyzer. So that makes security auditing kind of tough because basically you probably want some level of code intelligence, but you also don't want your computer to be owned if somebody did actually sneak something into a build script. So there's some options. Visual Studio Code has this thing where it will open in restricted mode, but then you don't get any code intelligence. You can review the source code on docs.rs. This is actually often quite useful because it gives you exactly what's in the crate file, not necessarily what was in the repo, because those might be different. You can look at the repo, but again, there's no guarantee that that's going to be the case. The only advantage, wrong slide, I'm sorry. This is diff.rs, which shows the difference between two versions of a crate. So this is the difference between Surday 10216 and 10217. And this is a really useful way of saying if you've already done a review of a previous version, then this gives you a way of looking at what changed. GitHub, but like I said, that may or may not match the actual repo. lib.rs will tell you if a repo doesn't match the crate file. We also have internal tracking of this at the Rust Foundation, and one of my great shames is in the last year I have not actually had time to turn that into a public dashboard, but I will at some point, I promise. So let's look at number 2, security. The Rust ecosystem has this thing called RustSec, which is a database of all security advisories known in the Rust and Crate ecosystem. The Rust Secure Code Working Group maintains this, which is part of the Rust project. And basically it gives you the security history of any crate that's ever had a security advisory. So I picked on Hyper, I'm sorry. Hyper has, the most recent one was in 2022. There's one in 2021. And, you can basically dig into them, and they look like any security advisory anywhere. This will look pretty familiar to you if you've ever looked at a CVE advisory or something like that. Affected versions. Probably this is the most important part, which is it tells you what version isn't affected. So if you know that if you don't see anything below Hyper 0.14.12 in your dependency chain, then you are at least good for this particular issue. And RustSec also provides a bunch of really good tooling to ingest this. RustSec, the Secure Code Working Group themselves have this cargo audit tool. And then there's also Cargo Deny, which is a third-party project that has much of the same functionality but more. I would very strongly recommend that you take one of these tools, probably Cargo Deny, because it can do a bit more, and put it into your CI so that when you update your dependencies, it will immediately tell you if there are security vulnerabilities, what licenses there are, if you're worried about license compliance, where they can be downloaded from, and so on. If there's only one thing you take away from this, if you work on Rust projects, put this in one of these tools in your CI. Now let's dive into something even fuzzier, which is development practices. Judging development practices from the outside of a project is really difficult, and there's not really a substitute for being involved. There are some metrics that you can look at. OpenSSF has this concept of a security scorecard. I'm not a huge believer in trying to just straight up blindly quantify how healthy a project is and how good its security practices are. But let's at least see what's in there, because again, maybe we can pick the bones out of this and see what's actually there. OpenSSF do not publish security scorecards themselves, but Google has this thing called deps.dev, which does, basically, and it includes all Rust crates. So I picked a popular Rust crate, I won't tell you which one, and I looked at its scorecard as of February 10th, 2025, and it gets 5.9 out of 10. Now, like I said, I'm not very interested in the overall score, but let's look at some of the categories. So one of them is called dangerous workflow, and we can see that no dangerous GitHub Actions workflows were detected in this repo. That's good, 10 out of 10, good job. Similarly, this crate is considered actively maintained. That is also good. But you do have to dig into this a little bit to see if you're actually getting value. So the code review says here 0 out of 10. Only 2 of the last 22 pull requests were reviewed. That sounds terrible. What are they even doing? So I went and looked at the project, and it turns out that 20 of the 22 PRs opened in this crate in the last, I think it was last month, were simply written by the author of the crate. So they're not getting reviewed because there is nobody else to review them. So that's probably okay. Now it says 0, and that definitely impacted the final score, but it also doesn't matter. So that's why you can't just say, oh, 5.9 is not very good, because not all of these are created equal. One of these, I think it's that one, actually just looks for whether the OpenSSF badge is in the README, and that is worth 10% of the score. So that's probably not that useful. And then finally, I like to look at sustainability. I think if you can identify some key dependencies, figuring out their sustainability is crucial. I have a whole half-hour talk on this, and I just saw the 5-minute banner, so I won't try and give the entire half-hour talk in the remaining time. But the point basically is open source maintainers are generally going to write better code, in my opinion, if they are supported and helped along the way. Now, contribution doesn't have to be just in the form of money, although most open source maintainers I know who have GitHub sponsors or some other form of taking money will happily take your money. But you can also help with documentation, with code, with maintenance, but the key is the best thing to do is go ask them what they need. Some maintainers may not want any help. This is actually completely valid, but many of them will, and knowing what you can do to help is crucial. So, in conclusion, the price of a secure supply chain is constant vigilance. There are many actors, including the Rust Foundation, including Alpha Omega, including OpenSSF, who are looking at the whole ecosystem and multiple ecosystems for Rust, for Python, for others, to try and make sure that things are as secure as they possibly can be. But at some point, you also have to look at your own dependencies as well and make sure that you're making good choices about what you're bringing in and what you're using and how you update them. And hopefully, this talk has introduced you to at least one tool somewhere along the way that you can use to make better decisions along the way. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for having me here.